Blood, sand, and steel. When you hear the word gladiator, what comes to mind? Epic battles to the death? Slaves thrown to lions? Maybe Russell Crowe yelling, "Are you not entertained?" in a sun-drenched arena. But how much of what we think we know about Roman gladiators is actually true? And how much is pure Hollywood fiction? In today's video, we're diving into the world of ancient Rome to separate fact from fiction, myths from reality. Let's step into the arena and find out what's real and what isn't. Let's start with one of the biggest myths out there. Gladiators always fought to the death. Movies love to show every match ending with blood in the sand and one gladiator collapsing dramatically in front of a cheering crowd. But the truth is, not every fight was a death match. In fact, most weren't. Gladiators were expensive to train, feed, and maintain. They were considered investment by their owners. It didn't make sense economically or logistically. Sure, some matches were deadly, especially in earlier periods or in executions disguised as entertainment. But many ended with one fighter surrendering or being too injured to continue. The crowd or sponsor of the games would then decide whether the defeated man should be spared. The famous term missio meant the losing gladiator was granted mercy, and that actually happened quite often. Some historians estimate the death rate per match might have been as low as 10%, depending on the era. Brutal? Absolutely, but not quite the non-stop bloodbath we're used to seeing on the screen. So were all gladiators fights to the death? No, that's a myth. Next up, another popular idea. All gladiators were slaves. Now there's truth to this one, but only to an extent. Yes, many gladiators were slaves, some were prisoners of war, others were criminals or people condemned to death by the state. But not all of them. Some men willingly became gladiators. These were known as actorati, free men who signed contracts to fight in exchange for prize money, fame, food, and sometimes even glory. For some it was a way out of poverty. For others it was about chasing thrill and status. Kinda like ancient Rome's version of MMA fighters. And then there were truly bizarre cases, like Emperor Commodus, who fancied himself a gladiator and fought in the arena for show, though of course his matches were always staged in his favor. So yes, a lot of gladiators were slaves, but to say all of them were, that's not accurate. This one's only partially true. Now here's one that is true, and probably more surprising than most myths. Gladiators were admired and even loved by Roman citizens. Absolutely true. They were sex symbols, status symbols, pop culture icons. Some became household names. They had fans, followers, and lovers. In Pompeii, graffiti has been found praising specific fighters, calling them the delight of the girls, or the one who makes all of the women sigh. Successful gladiators could even become wealthy, enjoying perks that resembled modern sports celebrities. They might be invited to parties, paid appearance fees, or even gifted land and homes. Their lives were still dangerous and far from easy, but within Roman society, they were admired, sometimes obsessively so. What about the idea that the Colosseum was the main place gladiators fought? The Colosseum is iconic. It's what we picture first when we think of Roman entertainment. But gladiator fights didn't only happen there. In fact, by the time the Colosseum was completed in 80 AD, gladiator games had already been around for over 200 years, and they happened all over the Roman Empire, in Pompeii, in Capua, in small towns, in distant provinces. Amphitheaters existed from Britain to Syria, and each had their own versions of the game. The Colosseum was the biggest and flashiest, Rome's main stage, but it wasn't the only one. Think of it like Madison Square Garden, but there were hundreds of smaller venues spread across the empire. So this idea that all gladiator battles happened in the Colosseum, definitely a myth. Here's a belief that we already touched on, but a lot of people don't think about. But they should. Gladiators were highly trained professionals, and that's 100% true. They didn't just get handed a sword and shoved into the arena. Gladiators trained for months, sometimes years, in specialized schools called ludi gladiatori. They were taught by instructors, often former fighters themselves, and practiced with wooden weapons before moving into the real thing. There were different fighting styles, each with unique weapons and armor. The retiarius used a net and trident. The murmillo carried a heavy shield and sword. The thraex had a curved blade and a small square shield. Each style had strengths and weaknesses, and matchups were carefully arranged for balance and entertainment value. It was like ancient MMA, testing different types of fighting against each other. Boxing, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, wrestling, Muay Thai, and all the other martial arts that are out there, with a dramatic flair. So the idea that they were just brutes with no skill, total nonsense. They were trained, skilled, and incredibly disciplined. Alright, what about the classic image of gladiators fighting wild animals? That's another crowd favorite in the movies. And yes, animals were definitely a part of Roman games. But here's the twist. Most of the time, gladiators didn't fight them. Animals were handled by specialized performers called bestiari. These men were trained for hunting and performing with beasts like lions, bears, crocodiles, and even elephants. Sometimes condemned prisoners were thrown to animals as public executions, and in rare cases a gladiator might be forced into this kind of battle as a punishment. But it wasn't the norm, so this idea that every gladiator was regularly thrown into a lion pit, that's Hollywood, not history. Another myth. So what have we learned? Some of what we think about gladiators is true. They were admired, they were professionals, and sometimes, yes, they did die in the arena. But much of what we imagine, endless death matches, animal fights every day, or all of them being slaves, just doesn't hold up to history. The truth is, gladiators were far more complex than the stereotypes. They were athletes, entertainers, and tools of propaganda, and in some cases, willing participants in Rome's most brutal tradition. Are there any myths that you can think of that I didn't name? Drop them in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe and check out some of my other videos. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.